The dust of the 13th century hung heavy in the air, for the known world had been shaken by the thunder of hooves. From the steppes of Mongolia to the forests of Eastern Europe, from the plains of Persia to the cities of China, the Mongols had swept across kingdoms like an unstoppable storm. They were more than conquerors. They were a phenomenon, a force that reshaped the destinies of empires and the course of civilizations. The sight of their banners on the horizon was enough to make cities surrender without resistance. Their reputation as ruthless warriors, amplified by stories of entire populations extinguished, of lands emptied in fire and ash. Few dared stand against them, and fewer still survived the attempt. For decades their expansion seemed irreversible, a tide that could drown any army that dared oppose it. Yet in the year 1260, in the fertile valley of Palestine, the tide would be checked. For the first time in open battle, the Mongols would know defeat, and the victors would be men who until that moment were considered fractured, desperate, and vulnerable. The Battle of Ain Jalut was not just another clash of armies, it was a turning point, a moment when the seemingly inevitable course of history shifted. To understand the weight of that battle, one must look back to the nature of the Mongol war machine. Under the vision of Genghis Khan, they had built not merely a tribal confederation, but a disciplined and highly organized army. Their core was cavalry, swift horse archers who could maneuver with astonishing speed, firing arrows while retreating as easily as when charging forward. They perfected the art of feigned retreats, of drawing enemies into traps, of encircling them with relentless precision. More than warriors, they were engineers of conquest. Cities fell not only to their swords, but to their siege engines, to the terror they inspired, to the calculated brutality that ensured resistance was punished with annihilation. By the middle of the 13th century, their empire was the largest the world had ever seen, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. The Near East had already felt their wrath. In 1258, Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, was crushed by Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis. The city, once the beating heart of scholarship and culture, was left in ruins. Its libraries burned, its population slaughtered, the Abbasid Caliphate broken in a single blow. The message was clear: no power was beyond their reach. From Persia to Syria, the Mongol advance seemed unstoppable. One city after another surrendered or perished. The Crusader states that clung to the Levant, remnants of an earlier age of war and faith, found themselves watching with both terror and fascination. For the Franks, the Mongols were at once a threat and a possible ally against their old Muslim adversaries. Yet no one doubted that if the Mongols turned their gaze fully upon them, the fragile Crusader kingdoms would crumble as swiftly as Baghdad had. Into this world stepped the Mamluks of Egypt, a dynasty forged not from ancient lineage, but from a core of warriors who had once been slaves. Purchased as boys from the steppes and the Caucasus, trained in the arts of war, bound by loyalty to their commanders, they rose to power in the wake of the declining Ayyubid dynasty. Their rule was still young and fragile in 1260, marked by internal disputes and external threats. But they possessed a hardened military elite, skilled horsemen who had themselves once been enemies of the Mongols on the steppes before being sold into bondage. Now they ruled Egypt, and with Egypt, the last powerful Muslim state that could resist the storm sweeping in from the east. The collision between these two forces was inevitable. After Baghdad's fall, Hulagu sent his armies further west, capturing Aleppo and Damascus. The Mongol advance into Syria brought them to the doorstep of Egypt, the heart of the Mamluk Sultanate. Hulagu's ambitions were vast. He envisioned nothing less than the complete subjugation of the Islamic world. Yet fortune intervened. News came from the east that the great Khan, Mongke, had died. Hulagu, bound by Mongol tradition, withdrew the bulk of his army to participate in the succession crisis, leaving behind a comparatively small force under the command of Kitbuqa, one of his most trusted generals. Kitbuqa was a man of great confidence and ferocity, a commander who believed even a reduced Mongol army was more than sufficient to crush the Egyptians should they dare oppose him. The Mamluks saw their chance. Under Sultan Qutuz, they gathered their strength. Qutuz was no stranger to hardship. He had been a prisoner once, a hostage in the struggles between empires. Now he stood as the unlikely leader of Egypt, tasked with facing an enemy that had humbled every great power before them. His decision was bold. He would not wait for the Mongols to march into Egypt, devastating the land as they came. Instead, he would lead his army north into Palestine to meet them head-on. It was a gamble of enormous stakes. If he failed, Egypt would fall, and with it perhaps the last hope of resistance. If he succeeded, he would achieve what no one else had dared imagine, the first true defeat of the Mongols in open battle. The march north was fraught with uncertainty. The Mamluks sought allies where they could, even negotiating temporary truces with the Crusader states to allow safe passage through their territories. The Franks, though distrustful, recognized that an unchecked Mongol conquest would spell their own doom. Thus, strange bedfellows emerged, and the armies of Islam marched past Crusader fortresses without challenge, their shared fear of the Mongols briefly outweighing the centuries of hostility that divided them. Every step closer to Palestine was a step toward destiny, and in the minds of the soldiers the shadow of Mongol terror loomed large. The valley of Jezreel, near the spring known as Ain Jalut. The Spring of Goliath was chosen as the battleground. Its terrain of rolling hills and open fields would favor cavalry, the arm in which both Mongols and Mamluks excelled. Yet it was also a place where the Mamluks could employ cunning, where the lessons they had learned from their former masters could be turned back against them. Qutuz and his lieutenants, among them the brilliant commander Baybars, prepared their strategy carefully. They would not face the Mongols in a reckless charge. Instead, they would use deception, drawing them into an ambush, exploiting the confidence that had so often been the Mongols' greatest strength. As dawn broke over the valley, the two armies faced one another. On one side, Kitbuqa's Mongols, hardened veterans who had known nothing but victory. On the other, the Mamluks, a force forged from slaves and exiles, standing as the last shield of their world. The silence before battle carried the weight of centuries, the knowledge that the fate of empires could pivot on what was about to unfold. Horses stamped the ground, banners rippled in the morning breeze, and men steeled themselves for a clash that would echo through history. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any the world had yet seen, a moment when the unstoppable would meet the unyielding, and the story of the Mongols would take a turn no one could have foretold. The first movements of the battle unfolded as if scripted by fate. Kitbuqa, accustomed to enemies breaking before the Mongol charge, advanced with confidence. His cavalry, clad in lamella armor and bristling with composite bows, surged forward across the plain, their war cries mingling with the thunder of hooves. Arrows darkened the sky, a storm that had broken countless foes in countless lands. Yet the Mamluks did not shatter. Baybars, commanding the vanguard, had deliberately placed his men in a forward position, daring the Mongols to strike first. The exchange of arrows was fierce, and when the Mongol pressure intensified, Baybars ordered a withdrawal. To Kitbuqa's eyes, it was the familiar pattern of victory. Once again the enemy faltered, retreating before Mongol might. He did not know that he was following the steps of a dance choreographed by his adversaries. The feigned retreat was an old Mongol stratagem, but now it was turned against them. Baybars's horsemen pulled back in good order, luring the Mongol forces deeper into the valley, closer to the concealed reserves that lay waiting in the hills. Dust rose in thick clouds, obscuring vision, and the heat of the September sun beat down upon men and beasts alike. Kitbuqa pressed on, eager to deliver the decisive blow. His warriors wheeled and pursued, their arrows hissing past the fleeing Mamluks. The trap was closing, though he could not yet see it. As the Mongols advanced, the Mamluks revealed their hidden strength. From behind the ridges, fresh cavalry units surged forward, their banners unfurled, their battle cries echoing across the valley. The retreat had been no rout. It was bait. Suddenly, Kitbuqa's men found themselves enveloped on both flanks. The hunters were now the hunted. Confusion rippled through the Mongol ranks. For perhaps the first time in open battle, the perfection of their maneuvers was disrupted by an enemy who knew their playbook, who had studied their tactics and turned them against them with ruthless precision. The fighting was brutal and intimate. Horsemen clashed at full gallop, the crash of steel on steel ringing through the air. Arrows flew at point-blank range, spears thrust, Swords hacked. The cries of the wounded and the roar of commanders filled the valley. The Mongols fought with the ferocity that had made them legends, but the Mamluks matched them blow for blow. These were no ordinary soldiers. Many of them had once been captives from the steppes, men who had grown up in the same world as their foes, men who understood the rhythm of steppe warfare, who could meet speed with speed, cunning with cunning. At the heart of the struggle rode Sultan Qutuz. Though rulers often commanded from the rear, Qutuz knew this battle was different. The stakes demanded his presence, his voice, his sword. When the Mamluk lines wavered under the Mongol assault, he tore off his helmet so his men could see his face, crying out to them not to falter, not to yield. His defiance rekindled their courage. In that moment he was more than a ruler. He was the embodiment of their cause, the living reminder that if they broke here, their families, their faith, their very world would be consumed by fire. Kitbuqa too fought with unrelenting determination. He was no stranger to adversity, and though outnumbered and pressed on every side, he spurred his warriors to resist. His Mongols fought with the desperation of men who knew that retreat was no option. Encircled, harried, they launched counterattacks, trying to break free, to carve a path through the tightening noose. The battle surged back and forth, a storm of dust and blood where victory hung in the balance. Hours passed, and the heat grew oppressive. Horses foamed at the mouth, men's arms ached from the endless clash of weapons, and still the fight raged on. At times it seemed the Mongols might yet escape, their discipline and ferocity carving gaps in the Mamluk lines. But each time Qutuz and Baybars rallied their men, closing ranks, pressing the advantage. Slowly, inexorably, the tide shifted. The Mamluks, fighting on familiar ground, drawing strength from the knowledge that behind them lay the last refuge of Islam, pressed harder. The Mongols, isolated without reinforcements, began to falter. The climax came when Qutuz himself led a final charge. With his sword raised high, he plunged into the fray, shouting the cry of faith that had sustained his men through the long hours of combat. The Mamluk cavalry surged behind him, their lances lowered, their voices joining in a thunderous chorus. The impact shattered what remained of Mongol cohesion. Kitbuqa's lines buckled, then collapsed. The great general himself was captured, defiant to the last, refusing to beg for mercy. His fall marked the end of resistance. The once invincible Mongol army was broken, its survivors scattering, pursued mercilessly by their foes. When the dust settled, the field of Ain Jalut was strewn with the bodies of men and horses, the air thick with the stench of death. The Mamluks, bloodied but unbowed, had achieved the impossible. For the first time in living memory, the Mongols had been defeated in open battle. It was not a skirmish, not a rebellion or a siege. It was a stand-up fight, and the myth of Mongol invincibility had been shattered. The psychological impact of that day cannot be overstated. For decades, the Mongols had seemed an unstoppable force of nature. Now, suddenly, they had been checked. The terror that had driven kings to surrender without a fight was tempered by the knowledge that resistance was not futile, that victory was possible. Across the Islamic world, news of the triumph spread like wildfire. For people who had watched helplessly as Baghdad burned, who had seen city after city laid low, this was a moment of vindication, of hope. The Mamluks, once dismissed as upstarts, had become the saviors of their civilization. Yet the victory was not merely a matter of faith or morale, it was also a triumph of tactics and preparation. The Mamluks had learned from their enemy, had studied the Mongol ways of war, and had devised a plan to exploit their overconfidence. They had mastered the art of deception, the feigned retreat that lured the hunter into the snare. In doing so, they revealed that the Mongols, formidable as they were not invincible. They could be beaten by those who understood them, by those with the courage to confront them directly. In the days that followed, Qutuz entered Damascus in triumph. The city, which had so recently bowed to Mongol occupation, now welcomed the Mamluks as liberators. Yet amid the celebrations, there lingered an awareness of how fragile the victory was. Hulagu had withdrawn much of his army eastward, but he remained a formidable power. The Mongols were not gone. They would return. The Battle of Ain Jalut was a turning point, but it was not the end of the struggle. The Mamluks knew that their survival would require constant vigilance, that the shadow of the steppe horsemen would not vanish so easily. Still, for that moment, the impossible had been achieved. In the valley of Jezreel at the spring of Goliath, the tide of history had shifted. A people forged from captivity had risen to strike down the conquerors of empires, and in their victory lay the seed of a new balance of power. The Mongol advance into the heart of the Middle East had been halted, and the world had learned that even the greatest empire could bleed. The story of Ain Jalut does not end with the clash of swords and the cries of victory on the battlefield. To grasp its full significance, one must look beyond the moment of combat and examine the forces that brought it into being, the fragile alliances, the ambitions, the rivalries, and the desperation that converged in that valley. The defeat of the Mongols was not merely the product of courage. It was the outcome of years of upheaval, of shifting power and circumstance, of choices made by leaders who saw themselves standing at the edge of an abyss. The Mongol conquest of Baghdad in 1258 had sent shockwaves through the world. The city had been not only a capital, but a symbol of unity for the Muslim world, even as the Abbasid Caliphate had long been weakened and its authority fragmented. Its destruction was more than material. It was psychological, a blow to the sense of continuity, a wound to the cultural and spiritual heart of a civilization. Across the lands of Islam, rulers trembled at the sight of Mongol banners. In Syria, cities like Aleppo and Damascus fell in succession, their populations left at the mercy of Kitbuqa's army. Resistance seemed futile. Those who dared oppose the Mongols often faced annihilation, and many chose submission, hoping at least to preserve their lives. Egypt was different. The Mamluk Sultanate was itself a creation born of instability. The Ayyubid dynasty, descendants of the great Saladin, had grown weak, its authority fragmented among competing princes. Into this vacuum stepped the Mamluks, once soldiers in the service of others, now rulers in their own right. Their authority was still contested, their legitimacy questioned, but they had one undeniable advantage: a professional military elite trained to the highest standards of the age. These were men who had been bought as slaves, raised in the barracks, hardened by ceaseless drills. They lived for war, and unlike the fractious nobles of other realms, their loyalty was bound tightly to their commanders and their corps. At their head in 1260 was Sultan Qutuz, a man whose life mirrored the tumult of his times. Born among the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, captured and sold into slavery, he had risen through the ranks by sheer ability and resilience. He understood the Mongols not as a distant menace, but as a force he had encountered in his youth, a storm that had swept his homeland. Perhaps this gave him a clarity others lacked. He knew that submission to the Mongols meant destruction, that negotiation was but a prelude to domination. When Kitbuqa sent envoys demanding surrender, Qutuz responded not with hesitation but with defiance. The messengers were killed, their bodies displayed. A calculated act, dangerous yet deliberate, a signal that Egypt would not bow. This was no easy decision. Within the court, factions debated the risks. Some feared that challenging the Mongols would doom them, that Egypt would share the fate of Baghdad. Others argued for appeasement, hoping to preserve their realm at least for a time. But Qutuz, supported by commanders like Baybars, made the fateful choice to resist. His resolve was more than personal courage. It was the recognition that survival demanded confrontation, that the Mongol wave could not be escaped but must be met. Fortune played its part as well. The death of Mongol Khan in the distant east forced Hulagu to withdraw much of his army. The succession of a great Khan was no minor affair. It demanded the presence of the empire's leading princes, and Hulagu could not risk his position by remaining absent. Thus, he left behind a reduced force under Kitbuqa, confident that even diminished his army could crush any opposition. That confidence was not unfounded. Until Ain Jalut, no power in the Middle East had withstood Mongol arms, but it was enough of an opening for Qutuz and the Mamluks to attempt their gamble. Equally significant were the unexpected choices of the Crusader states. The Franks of the Levant had long been enemies of Egypt, their castles and cities reminders of the Crusades that had scarred the region. Yet the Mongols represented something even more fearsome. The rulers of Acre and other strongholds saw that if the Mongols conquered Egypt, their fragile states would not long endure. For once, common interest outweighed old enmity. The Franks did not ally themselves fully with the Mamluks, but they permitted their army to march through their territory unmolested. It was a tacit recognition that the Mongols threatened all alike, Christian and Muslim, and that at least for a moment history demanded pragmatism. The Mamluk march into Palestine was therefore not only a military maneuver, but a statement of intent. They would not wait to be besieged in Cairo or Alexandria. They would meet the invader on open ground in terrain of their choosing. This decision, bold and dangerous, gave them the advantage of preparation. Baybars, whose tactical brilliance had already marked him as one of the great commanders of his generation, scouted the valley of Jezreel and selected Ain Jalut as the place to stand. The spring there promised water for the men and horses, and the surrounding hills offered positions from which to stage an ambush. Every detail was considered, every possibility weighed. The Mamluks were not charging blindly into battle, they were preparing a carefully set trap. It is here that one must appreciate the symmetry of history. The Mongols had risen to dominance in part because of their mastery of deception, of the feigned retreat, of the ambush that turned pursuit into disaster. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluks would use that very tactic against them. It was as though the sons of the steppe had met reflections of themselves, men who knew their ways intimately and who could anticipate their moves. That knowledge, combined with the iron discipline of the Mamluk ranks, created the conditions for a reversal no one else had achieved. When the battle came, and Kitbuqa rode confidently into the valley, he could not have known the trap into which he was galloping. His confidence was born of long habit, of a career that had seen enemy after enemy crumble. Yet history often turns on the arrogance of commanders, on the assumption that what has always been must always be. Qutuz and Baybars were counting on that very assumption, and they exploited it with ruthless precision. The aftermath of the battle reverberated in every corner of the known world. In the Islamic heartlands, there was jubilation. Sermons praised the Mamluks as defenders of the faith, as instruments of divine providence. In the marketplaces of Cairo, in the mosques of Damascus, the name of Qutuz was spoken with reverence, and Baybars's reputation began its ascent toward legend. In contrast, in the Mongol courts, the news was a shock. Though Hulagu would remain a formidable figure, though the Mongols would continue to dominate vast swaths of Asia, the aura of invincibility had been pierced. If they could be defeated once, they could be defeated again. The symbolism of Ain Jalut extended beyond the battlefield. It marked the emergence of the Mamluks as the leading power in the Middle East, the heirs to a legacy of resistance against foreign invaders. From this victory, they would build a reputation as the bulwark of Islam, the protectors of Mecca and Medina, the rulers who held the line not only against the Mongols, but against the remnants of crusader ambition. Their rule would endure for centuries, shaped in part by the glory of that September day. Yet the victory was also costly, and the unity it forged was fleeting. Within weeks, Qutuz would be dead, assassinated in circumstances that remain shrouded in intrigue, likely at the instigation of Baybars himself. Power in the Mamluk world was as precarious as ever, built not on dynastic continuity, but on the shifting alliances of military elites. The triumph of Ain Jalut ensured their survival, but it did not resolve the inner rivalries that defined their polity. Even in victory, the seeds of future conflict were sown. Still, the broader world could not ignore what had happened. In Europe, the news was received with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The Mongols, who had once threatened the borders of Hungary and Poland, had now been checked far away in Palestine. Some wondered if this meant the tide of Mongol expansion was truly turning, if the relentless force of conquest had met its natural limits. Others viewed it with caution, aware that the Mongols were far from finished. In Asia, where Hulagu regrouped his forces, there was fury at the defeat, but the complexities of succession and empire meant that immediate retaliation was delayed. Thus, the significance of Ain Jalut lay not only in what happened on that field, but in what it symbolized. It was a battle that proved empires could bleed, that terror could be resisted, that even the most unstoppable force could meet its match. In a century defined by conquest, it stood as a rare moment when the balance shifted, when the weak became the strong, and when history itself seemed to pause and take a different course. The triumph at Ain Jalut has often been remembered as a singular, almost miraculous moment in the history of the Middle East, yet to treat it only as a sudden reversal misses the deeper currents that made it possible. The battle was not a chance stroke of fortune. It was the culmination of a series of fractures within the Mongol Empire itself, of the political vacuum left by the fall of older dynasties, and of the resilience of a people who had been tempered by hardship. In many ways, Ain Jalut was less an isolated event than the visible crest of a wave of change rolling through Eurasia. The Mongol Empire, vast and seemingly united under Genghis Khan, had by 1260 begun to strain under its own immensity. The death of Mamluk Khan was not merely a dynastic tragedy, it was a destabilizing crisis. Succession in the Mongol tradition was never a simple matter of inheritance. It was a contest of strength, a gathering of princes where legitimacy was bound to bloodlines but decided by power. Hulagu, who had carried the Mongol banner into the heart of the Middle East, found himself compelled to withdraw the bulk of his forces to secure his place in this struggle. It was a reminder that even the greatest empire was vulnerable to the centrifugal pull of ambition. What appeared to the outside world as invincible unity was, in truth, a delicate balance held together by fear, loyalty, and constant victories. When that balance was disrupted, cracks appeared. For the peoples of the Middle East, those cracks offered a fleeting chance. The Abbasids were gone, their caliphate extinguished in Baghdad, but the Mamluks, young and untested as a ruling dynasty, stood ready to step into the void. Theirs was a power built not on lineage or inherited legitimacy, but on the efficiency of their military machine. This distinction mattered. Unlike dynasties grown complacent in the comforts of rule, the Mamluks were warriors first, rulers second. Their entire system was designed around the cultivation of martial skill and the ruthless selection of capable leaders. It was this meritocratic edge, born of the harsh world of slavery and soldiering, that allowed them to respond with clarity when others faltered. Qutuz embodied that paradox. He was at once a ruler and a soldier, a man forged in captivity but elevated by destiny. His decision to confront the Mongols was not made from a palace but in the saddle, alongside men who had shared his trials. He commanded not as a distant monarch, but as one who could be seen and heard in the dust and fury of battle. This closeness to his troops, this shared sense of identity, gave the Mamluks a cohesion rare among medieval armies. When Qutuz tore off his helmet in the midst of the fight and cried out for his men to stand firm, it was not merely a gesture. It was the visible bond of a leader and his warriors forged in blood and belief. The Mongols, by contrast, fought as conquerors far from home. Kitbuqa's men were fierce and disciplined, but they were a fragment of a larger host, left behind while their lord dealt with matters of succession. Their confidence lay in their long record of victories, in the knowledge that fear itself was their ally. Yet at Ain Jalut, fear shifted. The Mamluks were no longer fighting as defenders of Egypt alone. They were fighting as the guardians of an entire civilization, carrying on their shoulders the hopes of peoples who had seen their cities destroyed, their caliphate extinguished, their world threatened with erasure. That weight did not crush them, it gave them strength. The battle also underscored the power of terrain and preparation. The valley of Jezreel, with its spring and its surrounding hills, was not chosen at random. Baybars, ever the tactician, saw in it the chance to nullify Mongol advantages. The Mongols excelled in the open steppe, where their mobility could encircle and overwhelm. At Ain Jalut, the confined valley forced them into narrower lines, while the hidden reserves of Mamluk cavalry turned their own maneuvers into liabilities. The feigned retreat, that most iconic of Mongol stratagems, was answered with a mirror image. To be defeated by one's own tactics was more than a military loss. It was a psychological blow, a revelation that their playbook was no longer theirs alone. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Until that day, the Mongols were the teachers of war, the innovators whose methods reshaped the battlefield. At Ain Jalut, the student had surpassed the master. The Mamluks showed that with discipline, preparation, and understanding, even the greatest military machine of the age could be outwitted. This was the true legacy of the battle. Not merely that the Mongols were stopped, but that their aura of inevitability was broken. In the months that followed, the ripple effects were profound. Damascus, once occupied by the Mongols, fell swiftly back into Mamluk hands. Cities that had surrendered out of fear now looked to Cairo with renewed hope. The Mamluks were no longer seen as upstarts, but as defenders ordained by history. In mosques across the region, sermons praised their courage as divinely guided. The spiritual vacuum left by the fall of the Caliphate in Baghdad found a new anchor in Cairo, where the Mamluks would later install a shadow caliph, a symbolic figurehead meant to restore continuity to the Islamic world. Though the Caliphate was no longer the political power it had once been, the gesture mattered. It gave the Mamluks a mantle of legitimacy, a connection to a lineage that had seemed broken beyond repair. For the Mongols, the defeat was a rare humiliation. Hulagu, when he learned of Kitbuqa's fate, raged with fury. Yet circumstances conspired to prevent immediate vengeance. The internal struggles of succession demanded his attention, and rivalries with other Mongol factions diverted his energy eastward. The Middle East, for the moment, was spared the full weight of his retribution. This delay allowed the Mamluks to consolidate, to strengthen their grip on Syria, to prepare for future challenges. It was a breathing space, won not by diplomacy, but by the clash of arms at Ain Jalut. The wider world watched with fascination. In Europe, where the Mongols had once threatened the gates of Vienna and left behind tales of devastation in Hungary and Poland, the news of their defeat resonated deeply. Some saw in it a providential turning of the tide, a reminder that no empire could expand forever. Others were more cautious, aware that the Mongols remained a formidable power, their reach stretching across Asia. But in every court, from Byzantium to Paris, the lesson was noted. The Mongols could be fought and they could be beaten. In the Islamic heartlands, the victory took on a mythic quality. Poets and chroniclers described it as a triumph of faith over destruction, a moment when God himself had intervened to preserve his people. The reality was more complex. Strategy, timing, and political calculation had all played their parts. But myths matter. They shape memory. They sustain morale. They forge identities. For the Mamluks, the legend of Ain Jalut became part of their very foundation, a story they would tell again and again to legitimize their rule and inspire their warriors. Yet beneath the triumph lay tension. The Mamluk polity was not a stable monarchy, but a military oligarchy, a world where power changed hands through intrigue, where loyalty was often fleeting, and where rivals waited for any sign of weakness. Qutuz's assassination soon after the victory revealed this fragility. Baybars, his ally at Ain Jalut, would seize power, becoming one of the most celebrated sultans in Mamluk history. But the fact that such a betrayal could follow so swiftly on the heels of triumph showed that even in victory, the Mamluks were not free from the perils of internal strife. Still, history remembers not the daggers drawn in the shadows, but the thunder of hooves in the valley of Jezreel, the moment when the tide turned. Ain Jalut was a hinge upon which the door of history swung. Had the Mongols triumphed, the fate of Egypt, of Mecca and Medina, perhaps of the entire Islamic world, might have been sealed. Instead, the line was held and a new chapter began. The world had seen the rise of an empire that seemed destined to conquer all. At Ain Jalut, the world saw that destiny challenged, resisted, and reshaped. In the aftermath of the battle, as the bodies were buried and the dust settled over the valley of Jezreel, the weight of what had been accomplished slowly dawned upon the victors. For the soldiers who had fought at Ain Jalut, the memory of Mongol invincibility was shattered, and in its place was a new confidence, a sense that fate itself had turned in their favor. Yet for their leaders, the moment was as precarious as it was glorious. Victories often unite men for a time, but they also awaken ambition. And in the fractious world of Mamluk politics, ambition was both lifeblood and poison. Sultan Qutuz, whose leadership had made the triumph possible, returned to Egypt in triumph. Damascus had welcomed him, its people hailing him as the savior of Islam, and in Cairo, too, his victory was celebrated as a divine deliverance. But behind the cheers lay tension. The Mamluk elite, men who had risen from bondage to power, were not bound by dynastic loyalty. Their bonds were personal, fragile and often fleeting. To rule the Mamluks was to balance constantly on the edge of intrigue, to reward allies while keeping rivals at bay, to be both warrior and politician in equal measure. It was in this climate that Qutuz's reign came to an abrupt end. On the return journey from Syria, he was struck down by conspirators, likely at the instigation of Baybars, the very commander whose genius had helped secure the victory at Ain Jalut. Baybars was charismatic, ambitious, and immensely capable, and his motives were layered. Some said he resented Qutuz for failing to reward him sufficiently after the battle, others that he simply seized the opportunity to claim power in a world where hesitation meant downfall. Whatever the cause, the blade that ended Qutuz's life also cleared the path for one of the most formidable rulers of the Middle Ages. Baybars ascended the throne in 1260, and with him began an era of Mamluk strength. His reign would be defined by consolidation, by the transformation of the victory at Ain Jalut into a foundation for a durable state. Where Qutuz had been the commander of a moment, Baybars would be the architect of a dynasty. He reorganized the army, fortified the frontiers, rebuilt the shattered cities of Syria, and positioned Cairo as the beating heart of the Islamic world. More than a sultan, he became a symbol, the man who turned survival into supremacy. His greatest achievement, however, was not simply political or military, it was psychological. Baybars understood that the Mongols were not finished, that Hulagu still ruled vast territories, and that future invasions were inevitable. To prepare for them, he cultivated the memory of Ain Jalut as more than a battle. He turned it into a legend. Chronicles celebrated the victory as the work of divine providence. Sermons extolled the bravery of the Mamluks. Poets wove it into verse. In time, the narrative of Ain Jalut became inseparable from Mamluk identity. To be a Mamluk was to be a defender of the faith, a soldier destined to stand against the greatest enemies of Islam. The Mongols, meanwhile, reeled from the shock of their defeat. Hulagu, enraged by the death of Kitbuqa, longed for revenge. Yet the vast distances of his empire and the demands of succession limited his hand. The Ilkhanate, the Mongol realm that stretched across Persia and Mesopotamia, was powerful, but not all-powerful. Its armies could still threaten Syria, but the dream of pushing into Egypt had been broken. When Hulagu eventually sought to retake what had been lost, he found the Mamluks prepared, their fortresses strengthened, their armies disciplined, their spirit unshaken. The frontier between the Ilkhanate and the Mamluk Sultanate became one of the great fault lines of medieval history, a place where two worlds clashed repeatedly but never decisively overcame one another. It is important to understand that Ain Jalut did not destroy the Mongols. They remained a formidable force, their empire vast, their conquests numerous. In China, in Central Asia, in Russia, they continued to dominate. But it altered the trajectory of their western expansion. The path to Egypt was closed, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina shielded, the dream of uniting all the Islamic world under Mongol rule denied. The Mamluks had not only survived, they had drawn a line across the map of history, one the Mongols would never cross. The battle also redefined the balance of power in the region. For centuries, leadership of the Islamic world had been claimed by caliphates, first the Umayyads, then the Abbasids. By the 13th century, that structure had collapsed. Into the vacuum stepped the Mamluks, men without noble lineage, without dynastic heritage, but with the legitimacy of victory. By defeating the Mongols, they proved their right to rule. Their regime, born of the sword, was sanctified by the battlefield. In the eyes of many, Cairo became the new heart of Islam, its rulers the guardians of a civilization under siege. The symbolism was profound. The Mamluks, slaves who had risen to power, now stood as the saviors of their world. Their story was one of reversal, of the unexpected triumph of those least likely to hold power. This inversion echoed the battle itself, where the seemingly invincible Mongols had been undone by the very tactics they had perfected. It was as though history itself delighted in paradox, in turning weakness into strength and strength into downfall. Baybars's reign ensured that this paradox would endure. He was tireless in his campaigns, driving back not only the Mongols but also the remnants of the Crusader states. He fortified Cairo with new walls and gates, built mosques and madrasas, and cultivated an image of himself as both warrior and pious ruler. The chronicles of his reign blend fact with legend, portraying him as larger than life, a man of destiny shaped by the crucible of Ain Jalut. His legacy was not merely in the victories he won, but in the institutions he built, institutions that would allow the Mamluk Sultanate to endure for centuries. And yet, beneath the grandeur, the fragility remained. The Mamluk system was one of constant renewal and constant danger. Each new sultan relied on the loyalty of the military elite, and that loyalty was always precarious. The assassination of Qutuz was not an anomaly, it was a symptom of the system itself, where power was seized by strength and held by fear. The brilliance of Ain Jalut could never entirely erase this instability, but it gave the Mamluks something more powerful than stability. It gave them purpose. The story of Ain Jalut, therefore, is not simply one of a single battle. It is the story of a civilization at the brink, of men who rose from the margins to defend it, of an empire that was forced to reckon with its limits. It is the story of a turning point when the narrative of unstoppable conquest gave way to one of resistance and survival. The Mongols would continue to dominate much of the world, but never again would their expansion seem inevitable. And the Mamluks, for all their internal strife, would carry the mantle of defenders, their banners forever tied to the memory of that day in September when they stood in the valley of Jezreel and turned back the tide. The echoes of that moment reverberated far beyond the battlefield. They shaped the imagination of generations, altering how empires saw themselves and their foes. For the Islamic world, it was a reminder that no enemy, however mighty, was beyond defeat. For Europe, it was evidence that the Mongol storm could be weathered. For the Mongols themselves, it was a warning that even their seemingly limitless power had boundaries. And for the Mamluks, it was the cornerstone of a legacy that would outlast them all. In the years that followed Ain Jalut, the clash between the Mamluks and the Mongols did not end. The battlefield at Jezreel had marked a decisive check, but it was not a final reckoning. The Mongol Ilkhanate, ruling from Persia, remained a looming presence, its horsemen restless, its khans unwilling to accept the humiliation of defeat. Hulagu himself seethed with fury at the death of his trusted general Kitbuqa, yet the vast empire of the Mongols was no simple machine. The succession struggle following Mongol's death consumed attention, while tensions with the Golden Horde to the north further distracted Hulagu's ambitions. For a time, circumstance spared the Mamluks the full force of Mongol reprisal, but the memory of that defeat festered. Mongol pride demanded retribution, and over the coming decades, repeated attempts would be made to reclaim Syria and crush the Mamluk upstarts who had dared to defy them. Each new campaign carried with it the shadow of Ain Jalut, and each was met with fierce resistance. The frontier between the Ilkhanate and the Mamluk Sultanate hardened into a zone of perpetual conflict, a line across which armies clashed again and again, never achieving permanent dominance. It was under Baybars that the Mamluks transformed from defenders into aggressors. Having seized the throne in the wake of Qutuz's death, Baybars set about reshaping the very fabric of the Sultanate. He understood that the Mongols would return, and he prepared meticulously for that inevitability. Fortresses across Syria were rebuilt and strengthened, their walls thickened, their garrisons expanded. Roads were repaired to allow rapid movement of armies, and supply lines were secured. In Cairo, Baybars reorganized the military hierarchy, ensuring discipline and readiness at every level. He knew that survival required not only courage but structure, and he built a state designed for perpetual war. The Mongols did indeed return. In 1271, Hulagu Khan, Hulagu's successor, launched a campaign into Syria. Once again, Mongol cavalry swept across the Euphrates, their banners unfurling over cities that had seen their terror before. Yet this time, the Mamluks were ready. The lessons of Ain Jalut had been internalized, and the Mamluk armies stood firm. At the Battle of Homs, they clashed once more, and though the fighting was fierce and inconclusive, the Mongols failed to achieve their objectives. They withdrew, unable to break the defensive network Baybars had carefully constructed. The spell of Mongol invincibility had been broken at Ain Jalut, and each subsequent encounter confirmed that the Mamluks could not easily be swept aside. Baybars was more than a defensive commander. He sought to secure the legitimacy of his rule not only by standing against the Mongols, but by rooting out the remnants of the Crusader states along the Levantine coast. The Franks had been weakened by centuries of conflict, their numbers dwindling, their fortresses isolated. Baybars struck them relentlessly, capturing Caesarea, Arsuf, and Antioch. His campaigns against the Crusaders served a dual purpose. They eliminated potential allies for the Mongols, and they burnished his image as the champion of Islam, fulfilling the long-awaited dream of driving the Crusaders from the Holy Land. Each victory further tied his regime to the mantle of divine providence, reinforcing the narrative that had begun at Ain Jalut. For the Mongols, the failure to conquer Syria became a persistent frustration. The Ilkhanate, though powerful, faced challenges on every side. To the east lay the rival Chagatai Khanate, to the north the Golden Horde, whose leader Berka had converted to Islam and regarded Hulagu's campaigns against Muslim lands with hostility. The unity that had propelled Mongol expansion fractured, and the dream of a single empire spanning the world faded into the reality of rival Khanates competing for dominance. These divisions weakened their ability to mount sustained campaigns against the Mamluks, and Baybars exploited every advantage. He forged alliances, even with Berk of the Golden Horde, turning the rivalries of the Mongol world to his own benefit. In this web of diplomacy and war, Cairo became a center of gravity, its sultans playing the dangerous game of survival with remarkable skill. Yet the specter of Mongol power never fully disappeared. In 1281, at the Second Battle of Homs, the Ilkhanate mounted another invasion, this time under Abakar's successor Mönke Temur. Once again the armies clashed, and once again the Mamluks held their ground. The battle was brutal, marked by heavy casualties, but it reinforced the pattern established at Ain Jalut. The Mongols could win victories in skirmishes, could devastate towns and regions, but they could not break the Mamluk state in open battle. The line held. The endurance of this struggle reshaped the Middle East. The Mamluks emerged as more than defenders of Egypt. They became the recognized bulwark of the Islamic world. Pilgrims traveling to Mecca passed through lands protected by their arms. Merchants along the trade routes relied on their stability. Scholars and poets found refuge in their courts. Cairo, once overshadowed by Baghdad, rose to prominence as a center of culture and learning. The fall of the Abbasid Caliphate had seemed to many like the end of an era. Yet in Cairo, under Mamluk patronage, a new era began. The city became a beacon, its mosques and schools testifying to the vitality of a world that had refused to die. The Mongols, for all their power, could not extinguish that vitality. Their empire was vast but brittle, its conquests swift but often shallow. The Mamluks, though riven by internal rivalries, built a foundation rooted in military professionalism and a shared identity as defenders. It was this contrast that allowed them to endure, while the Mongols in the Middle East eventually faded into history. By the early 14th century, the Ilkhanate itself would fragment and collapse, undone by internal strife and external pressures. The Mamluk Sultanate, though not immune to its own cycles of intrigue, would survive long after. The memory of Ain Jalut was central to this endurance. It was invoked again and again in chronicles and sermons, as proof of divine favor, as the moment when the tide of history turned. For later generations, it became more than a battle. It became a symbol of resistance, a story told to inspire courage in times of peril. Even centuries later, when the Mamluk Sultanate had long since passed, the tale of that day in 1260 remained a touchstone in the history of the region. What is striking, when viewed from a distance, is how narrow the margin was. Had Qutuz hesitated, had Baybars miscalculated, had Kitbuqa recognized the trap in time, the outcome might have been entirely different. Egypt could have fallen, Mecca and Medina could have been threatened, and the map of the world might have been redrawn in ways we can scarcely imagine. The Mamluks themselves understood this. Their celebration of victory was tinged with awe at their own survival, a recognition that history is shaped not only by power, but by timing, by circumstance, by the will to resist when resistance seems impossible. Ain Jalut thus stands as a hinge of history, not because it ended the Mongols, but because it showed the world that empires, however vast, have limits. It proved that determination, strategy, and unity, even from the most unlikely of rulers, could alter the course of events. The slaves who became sultans, the soldiers who became saviors, had written themselves into history with blood and steel. And in doing so, they had preserved a civilization that might otherwise have been swept into oblivion. As the 13th century gave way to the 14th, the reverberations of Ain Jalut continued to shape the destiny of empires and the imagination of peoples. For the Mamluks, the battle had not been merely a tactical success. It had been the cornerstone of their identity, the justification of their rule, and the narrative thread that bound together a state forged by the sword. For the Mongols, it was a reminder of the limits of their power, a single wound that signaled the impossibility of conquering the entire world. And for the wider world, it was a turning point, a moment when the unstoppable tide of conquest met resistance and faltered. In the Islamic world, the legacy of that September morning was profound. The Mamluk Sultanate, though turbulent, became the unchallenged guardian of the faith's heartlands. Cairo rose to prominence not only as a military stronghold, but as a cultural and spiritual beacon. Scholars fleeing the devastation of Baghdad found refuge in the city. Artists, jurists, and theologians flourished under Mamluk patronage. The revival of the Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo, though ceremonial, lent legitimacy to their rule and connected them symbolically to the great past of Islam. All of this was underpinned by the memory of their victory, by the story of how they had stood alone against the Mongol horde and triumphed. The victory at Ain Jalut was retold in chronicles as divine intervention, as proof that God had favored the Mamluks in their hour of need. Preachers wove it into sermons, poets immortalized it in verse, and storytellers carried it across markets and courts. It became more than a battle. It became a myth, a touchstone of resilience, an affirmation that faith and courage could withstand even the mightiest of foes. In this sense, the battle belonged not only to the Mamluks, but to all who saw themselves as heirs to the civilization they had saved. For the Mongols, the memory was more complicated. They remained formidable across much of Asia, their dominions stretching from the steppes to the coasts of China. Yet the aura of inevitability that had carried them forward began to dim. At the far western edge of their empire, the Ilkhanate never recovered from its failure to secure Syria. Its campaigns against the Mamluks became stalemated, its energies drained by rivalries with other Mongol Khanates and by the difficulty of sustaining long campaigns in hostile terrain. The dream of reaching Egypt, of controlling the Red Sea, and perhaps the holy cities themselves, faded into impossibility. By the mid-14th century, the Ilkhanate would disintegrate altogether, its territories fragmenting into smaller states, while the Mamluks endured. The echoes of Ain Jalut also reached Europe. For decades, Christendom had lived in awe and terror of the Mongols, who had devastated Hungary and Poland, and who had seemed capable of reaching the Atlantic. Yet when word spread that the Mamluks had defeated them in open battle, a new understanding began to take root. The Mongols were still feared but no longer invincible. Diplomats and merchants from Italy and France who visited the Levant carried home tales of the victory, and in some courts, the event was received with quiet relief. The balance of power in the Mediterranean, already strained by the Crusades, shifted again as the Mongols were denied the opportunity to ally with the Crusader states against a common enemy. By holding the line at Ain Jalut, the Mamluks not only preserved their own realm, but reshaped the geopolitics of the entire region. The legacy extended further still. Ain Jalut was one of the first battles in which gunpowder weapons were reportedly used, albeit in a primitive form. Whether these early devices had a decisive effect is debated, but their presence is a reminder that this was not only a clash of civilizations, but a moment on the cusp of technological transformation. The Mamluks, by adapting quickly and blending traditional cavalry tactics with emerging innovations, demonstrated the flexibility that would allow them to survive in a changing world. The Mongols, whose brilliance had always lain in mobility and shock, found themselves countered by a foe that had learned from them and turned their own methods against them. And yet, For all its grandeur, the story of Ain Jalut is also a reminder of fragility. The Mamluk Sultanate, for all its strength, was riven by factionalism, its sultans often rising and falling by intrigue and assassination. Its survival was never guaranteed, and its victories often hung by a thread. The men who fought at Ain Jalut could scarcely have known that their triumph would echo for centuries, that historians and poets would one day look back on their charge in the Jezreel Valley as a hinge of world history. They fought most likely for survival, for their comrades, for their commander, and for the lands they called home. Yet by winning, they altered the course of civilizations. The enduring power of the story lies in its paradoxes. The Mamluks, born in slavery, became kings. The Mongols, who had seemed unstoppable, were halted. The battle was both a desperate gamble and a calculated trap. Its consequences were immediate and yet rippled across centuries. It was at once a military engagement and a symbol, an event rooted in the dust of a valley and a legend that outgrew its place. Looking back, one sees in Ain Jalut not only a victory, but a turning point in the very idea of empire. The Mongols had demonstrated that sheer force could conquer vast lands, that mobility and discipline could overwhelm even the greatest of kingdoms. But the Mamluks demonstrated that determination, unity, and adaptation could resist even the most terrifying of foes. In this sense, the battle speaks to something universal, the capacity of human societies to endure, to resist, to defy the odds when survival is at stake. In the centuries that followed, the Mamluks themselves would eventually fall, undone not by Mongols but by the rising power of the Ottomans. In 1517, the Ottomans conquered Egypt, ending the Mamluk Sultanate and bringing Cairo under their dominion. Yet even then the memory of Ain Jalut persisted. Ottoman chroniclers too acknowledged its importance, recognizing it as the moment when the tide of Mongol expansion had been checked. The legend outlived the state that had created it. Today, Ain Jalut stands in the collective memory as both a battle and a symbol. For some, it is the story of Muslim resilience, the day when the Islamic world was saved from obliteration. For others, it is a lesson in the limits of conquest, a reminder that no empire, however vast, can expand without end. For all, it is a moment when the course of history might have turned one way but turned another, reshaping the destiny of millions. In the valley of Jezreel, the landscape has changed over the centuries. The fields are quieter now. The hills no longer echo with the thunder of hooves or the clash of steel. Yet the story lingers, carried in chronicles, remembered in legend, studied in history. The dust of that battlefield long settled, the bones of those who fought long since returned to the earth. But the meaning endures. Ain Jalut remains a testament to the fragility and resilience of civilizations, to the way a single day can alter the trajectory of empires. The first Mongol defeat in open battle was more than a clash of arms. It was a moment that defined an age. From it sprang the rise of Cairo as a new capital of Islam, the decline of Mongol ambitions in the West, and the enduring idea that no power is beyond challenge. In its aftermath, men wrote, prayed, and ruled differently, their imaginations reshaped by what had occurred. And as long as history is told, the story of that day in 1260 will remain, a story of dust and blood, of courage and fate, of the first Mongol defeat in open battle, the Battle of Ain Jalut,